Smith, the 142 acres that make up the contiguous campus are part of the Botanic Garden. This includes what we call our named gardens, such as the Rock Garden, Capon Garden, and the Japanese Garden, our Arboretum, or tree collection, and our Tropical and Temperate collection, found in the Lyman plant house. These are plants that would not survive through a New England winter without additional protection. Each plant is labeled and tracked through our database. Ours is a living collection, ever-changing due to the passing seasons. Today, the Botanic Garden is used in classes across the curriculum, from the biological sciences to dance, art, engineering, and language arts.
Hi, I'm Jimmy Grogan. I'm a curator and manager of Lyman Plant House. I think the best place to start on a tour of Lyman Plant House is from the outside so that you'll recognize us when you arrive on campus. Of course, the greenhouse is pretty obvious when you see it, right? Lyman, the building, is a beautiful structure. It's white because we apply a special shade paint every spring that reduces the summer heat buildup under glass from the sun. The summertime rain and hot weather gradually thins the paint and eventually gets scraped off by the first snow and ice of winter so that we have clear glass and more light indoors during the long winter months. Lyman isn't a single structure but several that have been built together over the years in sections that we call houses, with 12 separate houses altogether. Houses are separated from one another on the inside by glass walls that allow us to create and maintain different growing environments to suit the needs of plants from nearly every region on Earth. We'll move through the houses more or less from the oldest to the most recently added, which means we'll begin in succulent and show houses, which we saw from the outside in the first view. Succulent House does exactly what its name says it does. It houses our really amazing collection of succulent plants from arid regions around the world. That's the perfect lead-in to describing for you how we use the houses as growing environments. Arid regions, known as deserts when in extremis, are pretty easy to understand. While we generally think of them as hot, they can also be quite cold, for example, when they occur at northern latitudes or at high altitudes. That said, they are always in one way or another extremely dry from the point of view of plant life. So in the succulent house, we do our best to simulate those growing conditions in order to make these arid region plants think they're at home. We do this by managing temperature and water. During the New England summertime, which corresponds to most of these plants' growing season, it's blazing hot in here. Anyway, succulent house is hot and moist in summer. I wouldn't say wet quite. Then cool and dry in winter. All the houses have their different temperature and water cycles through the seasons, depending on who the inhabitants are. Plant families, what do I mean by that? As I'm sure you're already aware, we make sense of the incredible diversity of the natural world through a hierarchical system of naming and classifying. Closely related species are grouped into genera. Closely related genera are grouped into families, and the family concept allows us to see how different species of plants originating from different continents may be more closely related than plants growing together in for example, a New England forest. Anyway, the main plant families in here in the succulent house are the cacti, or the Cactaceae as I prefer. Note that "ce" on the end of a word means I'm naming a family. The Cactaceae, which are only found in desert regions of North, Central, and South America. And we have in here also the succulent euphorbias, members of the family Euphorbiaceae, which we can think of as the cacti of Africa and South Asia. They look and behave like cacti, but in fact aren't even distantly related. We also find in here the Crassulaceae, the jade plant family. These are found both in the Americas and in Southern Africa, and often grow in a spiraling rosette form with showy flowers. And also the Asphodelaceae, the aloes and haworthias, which like many of the Crassulaceae are rosette-type plants from Africa, and strongly resembling the aloes but from the Americas, and also from a different family of the agaves. We actually grow the aloes and agaves outside during the summer in full sun right outside of the succulent house. Next to succulent house, as part of the same original greenhouse structure, is the house we call show. Really, you can feel how old these two houses are when you're in here. The structure, the glass, the walls, these houses are from the 1890s, and that's a long time to be a greenhouse. What does that mean, show house? Well, back in the day, in the early days of Smith College and of this plant house, the very first horticulture class in the year 1900 staged the first fall chrysanthemum show, or mum show, in this space, and the first bulb show the following spring. And both shows have been a Smith College tradition ever since. The mum show runs the first 2 weeks of November every year, this year included, and the bulb show runs the first 2 weeks of March. But not in show house anymore. It was moved to larger spaces that we'll visit shortly. Nowadays, show house is dedicated to plants that are intensely fragrant in one way or another. Usually they're flowers, but it could be any part of their bodies. For example, their leaves when you brush or handle them. The major plant families represented in here are the mints, as you might imagine, the Lamiaceae, which includes a lot of culinary herbs like rosemary, basil, oregano, peppermint, and spearmint. We also find the geraniums with their intensely fragrant leaves in here, and the fragrant olives, osmanthus, in the family Oleaceae. Fern house. Nowadays, fern house is where the ancient plants hang out, or rather I should say the ancient plant lineages, the earliest vascular plants, the ferns, which are short spore-bearing, and more recently appearing on Earth but still ancient, the cycads and the gymnosperms or conifers, which are seed-bearing but not yet modern seed plants. These lineages date back 400, 350, 300 million years on this planet. The environment in here from fall to spring is quite different from show and succulent houses. We keep it warm and wet year-round because these ferns are mostly tropical plants that grow in deep shade on the forest floor. To create the shade that they need, we keep large, tall, leafy plants on the benches to raise the equivalent of a forest canopy overhead, including several gigantic Titan arum plants or corpse flower plants that are currently in their vegetative growth phase. That means that what you see growing up from each pot is a single above-ground leaf, and what looks like a stem is actually a thick petiole with the spreading leaf blade above like an umbrella. One of these, our biggest Titan arum, is almost 10 feet tall this year, and it may flower soon. It's actually pretty exciting. Palm house. Remember this one from the outside? The tall one? It feels way bigger on the inside. When people think of Smith College Botanic Garden Lyman Plant House, I imagine most often they're looking at a mental image of inside Palm House, because Palm House, like no other house in Lyman, makes you feel like you've been transported to another place. This is a tropical space, warm, wet, and humid year-round, dense like a tropical forest, and it's been like this from the beginning in 1895. In this space, we grow a huge variety of plants from tropical forests around the world, with an emphasis on economically important species, especially plants that feed us or season our food. Because we have a large volume of growing space to work with, we can grow trees in here like the chocolate tree, Theobroma cacao, that has stood near the front entrance since the 1930s, or the guava tree just behind it, or the banana trees. What else do we have in here? To name just a few others. An allspice tree, a member of the eucalyptus family, the Myrtaceae, a quinine plant, which is another coffee family plant, the Rubiaceae, that produces the anti-malarial drug chloroquine. There's so much to see in here. I hope you'll come see when you come to Smith. Stove house, yes, that's stove, S-T-O-V-E. What's that name about? Well, from here forward, the names of the houses get a little weird, or to be kind, let's just say they get a little obtuse. Back in the day, in the very earliest days, Lyman was heated by wood stoves, and the main stove was located at the far end of this house, where you can still see its brick foundation underneath the bench. I don't know much about how this space has been used over the years, but today it's essentially a tropical space like palm and fern houses, warm, wet, and humid through the winter, especially humid because of the concrete pond that runs down its center, which is perfect for growing tropical epiphytes from one huge family, the orchids or Orchidaceae, and another also quite large family, the Bromeliaceae, or the air plants. Epiphytes. What are epiphytes? Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants, not as parasites, but just using them to sit or perch, a place to hang on to and pursue your life's purpose, which is to survive, to grow, and to multiply if you can. The next house besides stove is what we call a warm-tempered house, or warm temp for short. And honestly, I can't really explain this name, it just is. Again, warm temp is attached to stove, which is attached to palm, which, if you turn the corner and come back this way, is attached to fern, show, and succulent. Are you getting the picture? It's easy when you've worked here a couple of years like me. Anyway, warm temp is another warm and wet space in winter. And I think of this collection of plants as a kind of grab bag of botanical goodies, a mix of mostly tropical ornamentals that resemble or are related to many of the houseplants that you or your parents may have at home, but way fancier. We have a whole long bench of tropical aroids in this house, the Spath and Spadix family called Araceae that you might have seen a member of in the woods near your home if you live on the East Coast, the Jack in the Pulpit. This family has a very characteristic flowering habit, the spathe, which reminds me of a shield, which backs the spadix, or central column that bears the female and male parts. And down at the far or west end of this house, we have another small pond with several species of aquatic ferns. An interesting feature of warm temp and stove houses is how low the glass ceiling is compared to other houses, whether they're older or more recent. I don't really understand this, and there's no documentation available to explain why these houses, which were built at the same time as palm and fern, were built so low to the ground. As you might imagine, this makes them excessively hot in summertime, but easier to manage temperature-wise in winter. The next pair of houses that run parallel to warm temp and stove on their north side were built in the 1930s. The first of these, which you enter from the front reception area off of College Lane, is called Physiology, because it was built for a plant physiologist here at Smith College who used it as a laboratory and teaching space. Nowadays, Physiology House, with the house next door, which we'll see in a moment, is used to stage our fall mum and spring bulb shows, and otherwise as a general all-purpose display space where we can show off plants that we're especially proud of. The next house is called Cold Storage, for reasons I haven't quite been able to ascertain. Attached to Physiology, Cold Storage shares duties as our show space. Even though the mum and bulb shows only run for 2 weeks each, Cold Storage and Physiology are tied up by them as growing spaces for 5 or 6 months each year, when you account for the time needed to set the shows up and then take them down. In particular, the bulb show occupies this cold storage house from early January to mid-April. So we don't have permanent collection plants associated with these spaces, we just occupy them opportunistically for growing and display purposes as we can. From cold storage, we climb a short stairway into a corridor that runs between the older and newer sections of Lyman, which we call Camellia Corridor. This is a cool space in wintertime where we keep our ivy collection hanging along the wall, and where we'll move for the winter many of the camellias, rhododendrons, and citruses that you saw in Physiology and cold storage houses, since those 3 groups of plants all need cool winter rest. And we use a long bench that runs parallel to Physiology and cold storage to display cool-growing, winter-flowering orchids. The Cool Temperate House, or Cool Temp, is our other large volume greenhouse that you saw earlier from outside Lyman. As you might imagine from the name, this is a space for large plants that come from temperate or tropical montane forests around the world, and therefore need or can tolerate cool or even cold winter temperatures. Like the original show house, we run this house at 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, or 7 to 12 degrees centigrade through the winter. Cool Temp is divided by walkways into 4 sections, and each section is occupied by plants from either Africa, Pacifica, Asia, or the Americas. There's a waterfall back in the far corner, and a bench for visitors. We got a little bit out of chronological order stepping into Cool Temp, which was added to Lyman in 1981, before looking into the Blakesley Range, the 4th and final row of small houses that was built in the 1950s. These 2 houses are named for a plant geneticist at Smith who used these spaces for his research. And that's why today they're known as the genetics houses. One of them is a cool winter space, and we call this house Cool Genetics. The other is a warm winter space, and you might be surprised when I tell you that house we call Warm Genetics. Cool Genetics is mainly a staging space where we grow mums for the mum show and bulbs for the bulb show until they're ready to be moved into physiology and cold storage where the shows take place. Here in Warm Genetics, this house is kind of like my working office. This is where I do most of my most interesting horticultural work. Again, it's a warm winter space that faces south with good light, or at least the best light you can have in a greenhouse in wintertime. And it's in here where I grow, for example, new plants from seeds, or small plants into plants large enough to manage conditions in one of the public houses, or where we try to recover plants that for one reason or another aren't doing well. In Warm Genetics, I experiment with things. I learn from the plants as they grow and show me who they are and what they do and what they need. This is, for me, by far the most interesting, challenging, stimulating space in Lyman Plant House, where I get to learn and grow too. Oh, and I forgot to mention that both genetics houses are closed to the public, which does not include you when you arrive on campus as part of the Smith community. You are always welcome in the genetics houses. Finally, the last greenhouse, student greenhouse, set a little bit apart from the main structure of Lyman. What's in here? This is a space where Gabby Immerman's horticulture classes learn plant propagation techniques, and basically they use this space for their work and study. Okay, that concludes our virtual tour of Lyman Plant House. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. So interesting, in fact, that you decided to become a plant ecologist. Just kidding. Well, maybe not completely kidding. We could use more plant ecologists in the world, actually. Anyway, please be sure and stop in when you arrive on campus. All of us here in the Botanic Garden are looking forward to meeting you.